Hey everybody, let's talk Portuguese.
1, 2, 3,
Today we're going to be talking all about Portuguese and its legacy in Asia and surrounding regions. Before we get into today's video, if you are enjoying my channel and the videos that I make and you would like to support me, you can do so on Patreon. Patreon is basically a place where you can buy me a coffee each month, and in return you get access to special exclusives. Those include things like knowing about what I'm working on next first, extra resources from the videos that I make, including the sources that I'm using when I'm researching them, and other things that I might happen to stumble upon when I'm doing research into Portuguese linguistics. I even have fun things on offer, like postcards directly from me to you. So if that sounds interesting to you, head on over to patreon.com/Sashinka, where you can find out all of the details. Now, on with the video. I of course spend a lot of time talking about Portuguese in Portugal and Portuguese in Brazil on this channel, and I have dedicated a previous video to Portuguese in Africa, but there is still one large area left in the world that I have yet to talk about with regard to Portuguese. That, of course, is Asia and its surrounding sub-region. Asia, of course, is the world's largest continent, regardless of how you grew up learning the continental divisions. In today's video, we're going to be focusing on those regions where Portuguese traders set up colonies or trading posts. It would be in those regions where Portuguese came to be spoken. Some of those regions also persisted as Portuguese colonies through to the 1900s. All of this, of course, is to say that the presence of Portuguese in Asia, much like Africa and the rest of the world outside of Portugal, is due to Portuguese colonialism. India and East Asia were early destinations for Portuguese traders, and it is also true that the trade in India as well as the rest of Asia was significantly more valuable for the Portuguese Empire. One of the reasons that the Treaty of Tordesillas, which is the pact between Spain and Portugal that divided the world into two and ran right through the tip of South America, giving just a sliver of the Americas to Portugal and all of the rest of it to Spain, happened in such a manner, is because the Portuguese saw their pursuits in India and Asia as being far more lucrative, and they were for that time. The gold rushes and the discovery of great riches in the Americas would come to happen later on. So Portugal had a widely established network of trading points between India and East Asia. This includes even the Southeast Asian islands in what is now Malaysia and Indonesia. The result of this is that we have three major points in this area that persisted as Portuguese colonies. When we think about Portuguese-speaking Asia today, we think about East Timor, which is an island nation that shares a border with Indonesia and in fact gained its independence from it in the 1990s. Goa in India, which was a colony until the 1960s, and Macau, which was handed over from the Portuguese to the Chinese in 1999. These were some of the last holdouts as Portuguese colonies across the globe. And yet these colonies differ significantly from the Portuguese colonies in Africa, especially when it comes to linguistic usage. Portuguese is not a majority language in any place in Asia, not even in those three locations. In those three territories, Portuguese is spoken natively by a scarce fraction of the population. It never reaches 10% of the population in any one of those territories. There are, of course, more Portuguese speakers in those areas, but those Portuguese speakers are second language speakers. So even in a country like East Timor, which has Portuguese as an official language and is a full-fledged member of the CPLP, Portuguese is not necessarily a language of the population, rather than just a language of the administration and some of the media. Of all of these territories, East Timor has the most active growth in the usage and teaching of Portuguese in schools. That being said, East Timor is home to a bunch of different native languages. Those native languages eclipse Portuguese in East Timor, where Portuguese is not really used on a day-to-day basis. With that being said, due to its status historically as a colony of Portugal, those local languages underwent influence primarily lexically from Portuguese itself. So although Portuguese is not in day-to-day usage in a meaningful capacity in East Timor, its presence can be felt in the lexicon of these local languages. Portuguese is also official in Macau, where the local population mostly speaks Cantonese. There are few to no ethnically Chinese native speakers of Portuguese. That being said, there is a small contingency of ethnic Portuguese people who are resident in Macau. Those people make up nearly all of the native speakers of Portuguese in Macau. Regardless, Portuguese has a prominent presence in Macau for both cultural and administrative reasons. Macau is the main vehicle through which China interacts with Portuguese-speaking countries. Therefore, the study of Portuguese is extremely popular and very widespread among the local Chinese population. In recent years, enrollment at Portuguese language schooling has gone up dramatically among the local Chinese population, outweighing that of other ethnic groups enrolled in the same schools. Macau is often a stepping stone of sorts for students to go on to study in Portuguese universities or even study the Portuguese language in Portugal. The situation of Portuguese is bleakest in Goa in India, where Portuguese is really only spoken by an older generation and has not been systematically transmitted on to the newer generations. The Goan connection to Portugal is perhaps the most tenuous of all of these different territories. With that being said, the number of native speakers of Portuguese in Goa is negligible, and Portuguese is not the predominant second language taught in Goan schools. It is highly likely that Portuguese and Portuguese-based Creoles in Goa will fully die out within a few generations. Now, with the status of all of these territories and certain other points in Southeast Asia as Portuguese colonies up until the 1900s, all of the Portuguese spoken in these areas has something in common. Because there are very low levels of local native Portuguese, there are no truly native local dialects of Portuguese to speak of. The reason for this is that Portuguese is spoken as a second language in all of these regions. So the Portuguese that is spoken across Asia and all of the surrounding regions is basically purely European Portuguese. The Portuguese taught in schools in East Timor, Goa, and Macau is European Portuguese, and students that learn Portuguese to fluency in these regions speak European Portuguese. Often those students in those regions that attain a high degree of fluency speak Portuguese that is largely indistinguishable from continental European Portuguese. So although the picture of Portuguese across Asia seems fairly bleak, it does still serve a strategic position in those territories that I've mentioned. Goa is the Indian connection to Portugal, Macau is the Chinese connection to the Portuguese-speaking world, and East Timor retains close ties with Portugal as well. But there's one special and highly unique case that I haven't gotten to yet. That is, of course, the case of Japan. When we talk about Japan in relation to the Lusophone world, we're talking about Japan and its relationship with Brazil. Brazil is the country in the world with the largest population of ethnically Japanese people outside of Japan. There are about 1.5 million ethnic Japanese people who live in Brazil today. The reason for this goes back to the early 1900s. Brazil is a country like many in the American continents that experienced massive waves of immigration from other places. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, the Brazilian government specifically incentivized migration from Europe to Brazil. There are, of course, a bunch of different political motives behind this, which we will not be getting into in this video, but suffice it to say that Germans and especially Italians made up the largest portion of these immigrants. Italian immigration to Brazil was so widespread and the conditions of Italian workers in Brazil so poor that the Italian government effectively put an end to this migration in the early 1900s. Because Brazil faced a labor shortage as a result of this, and with a large Japanese population seeking greater opportunities outside of the Japanese countryside, the two governments formed an agreement that would allow for large-scale Japanese migration to Brazil. This is the birth of the Japanese population in Brazil. Most of the ethnically Japanese in Brazil are concentrated in the state of São Paulo. However, there are ethnic Japanese people across the country. As happens anywhere in the world with waves of immigration, each successive generation of Brazilian-born Japanese people came to become more and more Portuguese-speaking. By the third or fourth generation, this community became mostly monolingual in Portuguese. However, in recent decades, with the waves of Brazilians moving abroad seeking better opportunities, there has been a surge of ethnic Japanese Brazilians moving to Japan. This has resulted nowadays in there being about 300,000 Brazilians who speak Portuguese in Japan, making the Japanese Brazilian community the largest Portuguese-speaking community in all of Asia. This community stands out in Asia for having a singular connection to Brazil and no connection whatsoever to Portugal. So as we can see, the situation of Portuguese in Asia is one of great contrast. But there's just one other aspect of Portuguese in Asia that I have yet to touch on. I will be talking about Portuguese-based Creoles and how and why they came about in a future video. But suffice it to say, the Portuguese colonial presence in Asia led to quite a lot of Creoles popping up. These Creoles are especially prominent in Southeast Asia and India, although nowadays their numbers are dwindling and these languages are at risk of extinction. But I will be talking about those Creole languages in another video for another time. And with that being said, I dare say that has been quite a lot of information for this video about the status of Portuguese in Asia. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, if you learned something or otherwise found it interesting, leave me a thumbs up down below. You might subscribe to my channel if you're not already. I make lots of videos about the Portuguese language, which you can find in playlists directly on my channel or in the eye above, and I will see you next time.